Am I traumatized? In our interactions with others, we often quickly say that person is strange or they always act so know-it-all or they say such confusing things. But if we looked at ourselves, aren't we sometimes a bit strange too? It's so hard to question ourselves and observe ourselves from the outside. That's why I think it's worth considering the critical remarks others make. I'm not saying everything is true, because there are also many projections that have nothing to do with us, but still ask us to reflect in some way, even if it's simply about setting boundaries or distancing ourselves. Sometimes it's just about not being nice, but being clear and direct. Some could surely use more practice with that. I believe it's never wrong to give yourself a critical look. We just shouldn't overdo it. Many years ago, when I worked in a school secretary office, we had an annual employee appraisals. You had to be evaluated. The same questionnaire was filled out by both my boss and me. This created a web of points related to different areas. When the webs were laid over each other, it was clear to see the self-perception and the external perception. What made me really happy was that my image and my boss's image matched quite well. This indicates a good self-awareness and self-assessment. Additionally, it shows which areas I should pay more attention to and which further training would be beneficial. Such trainings are very useful. In the same company, we all attended a training course for a better teamwork. As I implemented the new tips. One of them also involved a member of the bosses. It totally backfired. He went to my boss and complained. I heard about it during the employee appraisal. First, they send us to a course. If we implement the tips, then it's no one of their businesses. Well, what can I say? I've never liked being led by people who understand less about the basics than I do, but unfortunately, I often had traumatized superiors in my life. That was a tough training. I dream of us engaging in exercises like the web in our close relationships, comparing self-perception and external perception and growing from that, to be able to tell each other what we perceive. Yes, that much honesty and much more I wish for us. Countries without borders, people without ID cards, food, air, water without poison, and so on. But that's another topic. Now, back to the question, am I traumatized? In systemic constellations, I've seen that the woman comes with an issue and says her husband has a problem that needs to change. But often there's a similar issue on her side. Both have similar experiences. The only difference is that the man and the woman react differently, which is why it's not visible. Everyone sees the fault in the other, and both partners project their inner world into each other. That leads to arguments. If one were aware of this and open to addressing their own story, many problems could be minimized and love could remain. This is the process, if not the meaning in relationships. How often could we remove the partner and maybe discover our father or mother behind them? Listen to the podcast when other triggers rejection in me. Now, how can you recognize if you are traumatized? As explained earlier, arguments with your partner might be a sign that there is something you need to look at. If something is still acting within you, it can negatively impact the relationship, or you might bind yourself to people who are supposed to show you something. They stay in your life until you've recognized and changed it. Once you do, they leave your field. And now, new people enter. There are several obvious signs that indicate trauma. Sometimes I thought if I had known this earlier, I could have spared myself a lot. Maybe. But through these sometimes extreme encounters, I had to look at certain issues and deal with projections. That helped me grow a lot. So it seems that my soul chose the right experiences for healing. In this podcast, I will list some characteristics. If you recognize one or more in yourself or someone else, they could have various origins. Often, we also carry generational trauma, things we didn't directly experience, but that affect us strongly. If we carry the trauma for our ancestors, it can sometimes result in us living out a different personal trauma. It's not always easy to distinguish this. I carried many ancestor traumas. They felt as a thought I had experienced them myself. There are different sources of trauma. The best way to identify them is by observing ourselves in everyday life. In the podcasts Steps to Healing and I Fail Repeatedly, I give some suggestions for self-observation and further steps. Sensitive people and those who have already dealt with their history develop a finer sense to recognize when something isn't right and sometimes where it might come from. When they come to me, they sometimes mention things casually like, my grandmother lost a child, or my grandfather was an alcoholic, or aunt had a disabled child. There are countless stories. This shows how the subconscious brings up relevant things that have occurred to be processed. A situation will be repeat itself until we've recognized, felt, and understood it, and then let it go. It's amazing how our system works. It always shows exactly what is ready for processing, and your system can handle it. To dive deeper into today's topic, you can, if you like, ask your subconscious to send clear signals as you listen. Simply set a clear intention and say, as I listen, I open myself to clear signals about the topic, am I traumatized? If it concerns you, you might feel a physical reaction. I've mentioned this in the podcast I Fail Repeatedly. Here they are again. This could be an uncomfortable feeling, a rejection or aversion to hearing it, tightening in the chest or heart, a shiver, goosebumps, or a distraction in the moment when you hear it, or other reactions. Now I will list some characteristics that could indicate trauma, but please be aware that not everything you carry belongs to you. It may have been adopted by others. Still, it all works through and within us, and we are often taken over by beings and parasites that control us. Some of these include contracts we've entered into consciously or unconsciously, voluntarily or under duress. Sometimes we also carry burdens for our family members and partners. The sources are diverse, and trauma is not just an obvious extreme event, but also subtle, unnoticeable experience that can deeply disturb us internally. Both of these aspects I mentioned in the podcast I fail repeatedly. Here are some characteristics. The most obvious for me is a rigid or vacant stare with wide open eyes. It's as though the person is looking out for a danger or staring into the void. A body that is constantly visibly tense with poor posture or deformity. Extreme fatigue, feeling life weary, thinking it wouldn't matter if I died, it would even be a relief. Workaholics who constantly overextend themselves and experience constant stress. Extreme sports, always pushing the limits. Verbally repeating themselves or constantly asking the same question. Not allowing others to finish their sentences. Reacting childishly during the smallest disputes. Abnormal sexuality or constant urge towards it, or rejection of sexuality. Addictions of any kind. Not feeling anything at all. Anger to rage. Anxiety, including specific fears like of water, fire, heights, flying, fear of loss, fear of failure, paranoia, fear of spiders or snakes, but also vague, undefinable fears. Feelings of guilt, selfishness and narcissism, inability to take responsibility, extremely sensitive to criticism, reacting inappropriately, procrastination, financial problems, constantly moving homes, frequently changing relationships, toxic relationships, loneliness, grief and depression, never being able to accept help from others, always wanting to help others and putting yourself aside, illnesses, general mistrust, fear of being poisoned, helplessness and feeling overwhelmed, not being able to listen to certain topics, confusion, losing orientation. These are just some examples, and there are more. Was any of this hard to listen to? Did one or more of these traits remind you of a situation or a person? Did a specific trait stick with you? Did you physically feel something? Or did you strongly reject a characteristic? These are reactions from your body. Everything is stored there and responds. What do you do with this now? If you noticed something, it means there is something to be cleared up. As mentioned, it may have been something you experienced yourself. It could be ancestral trauma, or it could come from a parallel life or a different origin. The most important thing is to admit to yourself that something is there. Yes, and then I can only tell you what I did. Well, my story was somewhat extreme and I had many traumas. When I began my healing journey, I was clear that I would walk the path consistently. Every time I encountered unbearable repetition at work or with my partner, I would examine it in therapy. Sometimes it was karmically connected to the person. Other times the person was just a placeholder for someone from my family. That was almost always the case. Step by step, I cleared it up and faced it. No, it wasn't easy. There were issues that filled me with shame, things that scared me, that plunged me into deep sadness or made me feel incredibly lonely. There were moments when I believed I had to die. But coming out of that hole meant gaining vitality and courage. It led to better relationships and more, I could shape my life in a way that felt good to me. I can only say it was totally worth it. I would do it again. And I encourage you, start your journey. Yours will be easier because the really good thing is that these processes are much easier nowadays. That's because of the time quality and because many have gone ahead, filling the morphic field with healing and solutions. The path is cleared and easier to walk. Fortunately, I always had good therapists and friends who supported me during that time. I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. If you're feeling lost, listen to the podcast Steps to Healing and I Fail Repeatedly. If you'd like to work with me on this, my contact is in the description of this channel. We can also do it online. Energy is everywhere. I hope something here serves you, and I sincerely wish you much success in your healing and self-discovery. I'm sure you are wonderful. I can do this. You can do this. Together, we are the change. In love and gratitude. Now.